It's a little warm. First of all, I'd like to say without the support of all of you in the community, this wouldn't be possible. The wonderful people of Ebenezer, we wouldn't exist. The Ebenezer Historical Society. I'd like to take a minute to thank each and every one of you for your support in making the EHS a reality. Today we celebrate with you the creation of the Ebenezer Historical Society and hope that you enjoy today as much as we enjoy having you here. I would also like to send out a shout out to all the people who worked so hard for this day to happen. Nelson Pruitt, Trent Pruitt, Emily Pruitt, Megan Hodgson, the volunteers of the Ebenezer Fire Department, Donnie Whitlock, Bob and Marcia Harralson, and my husband Chris and my son Brett. Thank you. Thank you, Pat.
Take a moment of your time to recognize our military veterans and all of our first responders. You are a veteran or first responder, please stand up or raise your hand and be recognized.
I'm not standing.
That's all you guys. And everybody else here that serves the military and freedom of the United States and takes care of other people at their own risk. Thank you. Next up is Marcia Harralson. Marcia?
Hello. Hello. I don't hear anything. Hello. We're so glad to have you here today. And on the count of 3, I want everybody to say Ebenezer. And if you don't do it right the first time, we'll do it again. So 1, 2, 3. Ebenezer! Thank you. As he said, my name is Marcia Harralson. I was born and reared right here in Ebenezer. My husband and I live on my grandparents' century farm. So if you come down 141, you will see a sign out in front that tells that it's a century farm. My grandfather's name was L.O. Bernie Wallace and his wife Alice G. Wallace.
We sat on a fire.
My husband and I both attended the little red brick school building that is still standing there. This area was very important in the beginning of the formation of Greene County. However, right now, I'm going to talk to you about the Osage Indians. This area had Osage everywhere, and there was a large number of them. We have a gentleman that has written way back, his name was Pike, and he had an expedition, and so he was going and traveling among the Osage and found out a lot about them and how they lived. So the Osage are tall, slender Indians, and they wore a lot of red and blue. And according to his writings, the material that they gathered, they dyed with berries and those kind of things to get those colors. And they had skins that they got from the animals that they hunted around here and made clothing, and their moccasins that they wore. 1804 was the home that we have history of, starting here with the Osage Indians. Mr. Pike found out that these folks were not warmongers. They didn't fight, but they sure did like to steal a horse now and then. So when the settlers came, that was something they had to kind of watch out for, was holding on to their horses so they didn't get stolen. They kind of got to annoying the settlers because the settlers were getting big tall trees to build their log cabins with, and of course that was their territory, and they didn't much like that. But they didn't do anything except just irritating and caused a little bit of disturbance among the settlers. So they hunted and they fished, and you may have heard of the Indian mounds, M-O-U-N-D-S, mounds in this area. And through studying the expedition's material, I found out that Mr. Pike asked what the mounds were for. And I found this to be quite interesting and pretty smart of them. They built the mounds and put their tents and lodges up on the mounds so that when it rained a lot, like we've had lately, the floor of their tents and their homes didn't get wet. How smart that was. And they also had lodges that they moved from one place to another when they would go hunting. And several men would stay in a lodge, and they would build these mounds big enough for a lodge to put those in. So now we'll move on to 1831. We begin to have interest from the settlers, and they were just so excited about the new country. Mr. Painter came here first, and he was from Tennessee, and then he wrote letters back to his relatives in North Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee. He told them about the tall timbers, the lush green meadows, and the fast-running streams and rivers. Soon, before you know it, there was more settlers that began to come here. And a lot of you may have ancestors that you've heard the names that had come from these other parts of our United States and settled here. But this was a special place, these people thought. And I had relatives by the name of David Bedell, Peter Wallace, and Elisha Headley, #1. And then he had Elisha Headley, #2. There was so many of them in those days, they used the same name. They called them #1, #2, #3, however many come down through the generations. So they, David Bedell and Elisha Headley, are buried over here at, they were Revolutionary War soldiers, by the way, and they're buried at Old Salem Cemetery. And if you don't know where that is, you can ask and we can take you over there or send you over there. It is now a historical site, and Greene County is supposed to be taking care of that, but it's an old cemetery with a lot of old stones that are hard to read at this time. My husband also had some relatives that came here, we found, and his name was James Harralson. And what it said about him was that he was an accomplished farmer. So farmers is something that the people in this area did. As the village grew, there were little businesses that sprouted up and started. A mill was one, and the mill was left here for quite some time, and even when I was a girl, even though that was many years ago, my grandfather would take wagons full of grain and corn over to the mill and have it ground and fed his horses and so forth. And he had a team of horses. They were white, and they'd pull a big long hay wagon, and we'd take it full of grain and go there. And the horses were took there also to be shod because the blacksmith shop was there as well. There was a post office. There was a millinery. That is a business that makes hats. And so they had a nice millinery here, several grocery stores, a cannery. And the story is told that the farmers would bring green beans and tomatoes into the cannery, and that would be just east of where the present fire department is here in Ebenezer, at a stream of water that was really rolling. And they used that to turn the machines and the big wheels that they used for canning. And there was a little quip that I read about. One lady said there wasn't any windows on that cannery, and so you can imagine it was a little bit ridden with flies. But anyway, they took their tomatoes and beans there to be canned. There also was a switchboard that was run by my great-grandmother Dillard, and she also had people bring her rolls and rolls of strips of material, and she had them woven into rugs, and she did that for many years. In 1832, they started having brush harbor meetings because they needed to have some place to worship. So my grandfather told me about the brush harbor meetings, and he said they would go and spend all day long, and by the end of the evening, some of them were really getting happy and really had the spirit. So that went on during the summertime. And then in the wintertime, they met in the homes and had what they call Sabbath school. So that's like our Sunday school. And that is what they had at first because there wasn't enough ministers to supply the churches full time, so they traveled around, and once a month the minister would come and have a service. So then in 1847, the Methodist Conference decided that this village, now that was thriving and growing, needed a high school. So they built a high school, and before long it became a college. And then they needed a high school, so the settlers got together and decided that they would build one. So the first one was a white frame building, and it was built by the residents. In 1891, the present Ebenezer Church was started, being built by the residents, and my great-grandfather was one of the carpenters. And he also, after the church was finished, served as Sunday school superintendent for 50 years. And then my grandfather followed in his footsteps after that. And I have to tell you, in 1893, my grandfather was about 3 to 4 years old, and he told me a story. He became where he was in poorer health, and we had more time to visit when he was home. So we sat and listened to his stories, and he told me about when his father would be up on the big tall ladder putting the ceiling, and if you've ever been in that church, that tongue and groove is on the ceiling, not on the floor, and that is what their ceiling was. And his father was up on the ladder, and my grandfather said, I was enthralled, and I looked and I watched, and my dad, he said, told me to move, Bernie, just move over, they might drop a hammer on you. He said, I didn't move. First thing I knew, he was climbing down off of the ladder and dusted my britches. Well, they were farmers in those days when they come to settle here. They brought animals with them, and they had livestock of all kinds, cattle, hogs, horses for riding and horses for working, sheep, chickens, other poultry. They also had an awful lot of mules, and my great-grandfather and my grandfather too were mule traders and mule trainers. So they trained these mules to work for them and pull wagons and pull machinery. In 1870 then, after all of the hard work that they put into building the businesses, Springfield got a railroad. Well, when they got the railroad, it was first come to the north edge of Springfield and came here from down Lebanon Way, and was kind of detained there for quite some time before it came to Springfield. So they finally got here. Well, then businesses from all around the area began to come and settle in Springfield. Well, that's when Ebenezer began to lose their businesses, and people were pulling out and going to Springfield. Soon, Ebenezer became a community instead of a village. So in 1915, the present road that you go through Ebenezer now, the curve around the church and all that, in 1915 was built and remains the same path that it was in 1915. But before that, the road came what now is the back of the church and came across my relative's property and all the way over what is now Highway 13, around Slagle area. And so that was quite a change for them to make it come right through the community at that time. And then in 1930, something great happened. They got electricity. And my mother has showed me the lamps, and we have the lamps in our home that they hung on the walls along in different places, and she did her homework by those lamps because there wasn't any electricity. So it was many years that they didn't have lights except through the lamps. And when the power was off, you remember when the ice storm was and we were without power for 2 weeks? I thought, oh my goodness, I sure am grateful for electricity. Every time you go into a room, you flip the switch and there wasn't any. So soon Ebenezer was now a village that had turned to a community. There were still many farmers in the area, and they kept farming for many years. And then now we have a few farms left that have cattle and fields of hay crops. But we are basically a community of homes in a peaceful, quiet place. I urge all of us to keep this community that was built on a firm foundation to continue to be a peaceful and wonderful place for the future generations to enjoy. Thank you.